right, so every major argument that I've read or discovered about against Aquinas' five ways takes Aquinas' philosophical reasoning into the realm of modern scientific knowledge. It seems to be the only metric that most modern skeptics have in their tool belts. So why do sciences like physics and biology and genealogy, etc., why do they fail to address the philosophical arguments of Aquinas?
Well, yeah, that they do, because so many of the modern scientifically trained people don't have a grounding in the fundamental philosophical concepts that Aquinas uses, borrowing primarily from Aristotle and other people. And I read in one source, it's kind of an irony that today, part of the reason, well, when Aristotle and Aquinas were writing, they were kind of trying to add some philosophical depth to the early scientific ideas, just the mechanistic way of looking at the world in terms of atoms and just purely simple causes and effects, pure materiality. Aristotle introduced deeper philosophical concepts like form, matter, and form, potency and act, to really make sense of things and to show the purposes behind things. But as modern philosophy has come out in recent centuries, modern science has seemed to have lost the ability to grasp these issues that St. Thomas Aquinas is writing about. I think another confusion they have is when he uses physical illustrations, he's just using them as illustrations usually, just to give some simple way of getting the gist of his argument. He's not basing his argument upon these examples.
So how can science aid our understanding of philosophical truths? That's kind of the opposite end of the coin there.
Well, sure. Yeah, and this is where Thomas's proofs really should appeal to the scientific minded, because they are all a posteriori arguments. In other words, we start with the evidence of the senses. All five of his causes start with something we can see out in the world, like number one, the fact that things move or that things change in one way or another. And then we work from that evidence of the senses, making causal inferences. And science is usually ultimately about finding causes and effects. And Thomas, he's doing that too. He's starting with the evidence of senses. Now he's using logical inference processes to work to higher and higher levels of causation that finally lead us to God. So the more precise we are in our scientific understanding of things, in a sense, the better set we are to understand God, because Thomas holds the view that the existence of things in the universe, material things, in some ways all reflect God because they come from God as the ultimate source. So when we look at the world around us, it gives us a starting point whereupon we can exercise our reason to work our way back to God who made all this possible.
So what you're saying then is that the study of sciences, or the study of anything that is sensatory, anything that we can see, feel, touch, breathe, all these things, all of that is basically a gateway to understanding the deeper truth, which is God within and around us.
Oh yeah, it sure is. It sure is. And so Thomas, he tries to make as few, presumptions as possible. When he's giving these five ways, they're based just on the evidence of the senses and reason. He's not, using scripture, revelation as his foundation for this. So he's using the effects of the natural world, which all scientists should be able to agree is a sensible starting point.
Excellent. Well, as we both know, modern critics have been debating Aquinas' five ways, especially those who are atheists. I'm thinking of Richard Dawkins and many others. They've been very much against St. Thomas and trying to disprove these five ways. And I'd like to read a few of them off to you that I've been reading through and just kind of see how you respond. Because I see a lot of people kind of discounting God because of their limited ability to understand that concept. I think that you said that it was very much chronological. And another argument that I read about concerning the second way is that since the proposal of the Big Bang theory, we've since learned that matter is continually formed as particles and antiparticles and continually annihilated when a particle meets an antiparticle. So there are no things that are caused or created by other things. Stuff only changes in form, and there's nothing being caused to exist. So ultimately, the Big Bang happened. This is what a modern critic would say. And since then, everything has just come into being as it is, and has, as you said before, constantly experiencing change, whatever change that may be, the acorn to the oak, the young man to an old man. The things are constantly being changed, but where does that necessarily need to be a creator that's creating all those things when we have a Big Bang theory? How would you respond to that?
Well, one thing I'd say with the Big Bang theory, when this, super dense, uh, beginning of all existence explodes, it's like, well, where did that come from in the first place? Where did the origin, that super hyper dense kernel itself come from? And it itself, obviously, according to this theory, it had the potential to create this entire expanding universe. But again, we have the idea of potentiality and actuality. If it was just sitting there potential, why, at what particular point in time did this explosion occur? So I think oftentimes when they try to give some kind of a fact, something that can be determined by science, they're kind of stopping short. Also like using, evolution is another example. If you're saying that we don't need God because, all changes caused through evolution, then it's like, well, where did the matter itself begin? Where did that come from? The substance that then changed. So I think that they're just kind of not really going deep enough there.
Mm-hmm. And I have another question about that when it comes to, if God did create the Big Bang, and if that is all true, and God did all these creations, who's to say that God is still alive if all the changes are continually changing and evolving, if you will, to become what we currently are? Could God have started it, but be dead, and now it's just a constant echo of his first creation, and there is no God?
Yeah, and there's some arguments out there, even some arguments for God almost boil down to that, the idea that God is just the watchmaker who kind of started everything rolling, but is he still out there? Is he still active? But now all Thomis's proofs, again, this is the idea that he's not going back in time. It's saying all these 5 proofs depend on God right now. For example, on the one for the one on based on motion, why things move. It's not just entirely chronological. Even one of Thomas's simple examples, he says just example of a hand moving a staff, moving a stick. The stick doesn't move on its own, without the action of the staff. So the staff is kind of a mover there. But even if we extend that a little bit, now the staff being moved by the hand, I'm using that staff, let's say, to flip off a light switch. Okay, so the light switch doesn't go off unless the staff moves it, and the staff doesn't move unless I move my hand, right? But for any of those to exist, that first one always has to be there. Nothing happens unless all the series of causes are operating at the same time. They're instantaneous. So in some ways, all the changes in the world need a simultaneous cause right now to explain them, because they can't explain themselves. And again, it's not a matter of time. Thomas did believe that the world was created because it came through Scripture. Again, he wasn't sure philosophically if that could be proven. But even granting that premise, his arguments are designed to show that God must be here now, not merely as a creator sometime in the past, but as a sustainer, because nothing in the world itself right now can sufficiently explain the nature of the way things are, why there are causes and effects, why things move and change, and so on.
Okay. In Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, he attempted to disprove all of these 5 ways from Aquinas, and at one point he said that omnipotence and omnipotence are mutually incompatible. So that basically means that God cannot be all-knowing and all-powerful at the same time. Otherwise, he already knows how he will intervene in a point in history. And that means that he can't change his mind about intervening, which subsequently means that he cannot be omnipotent. How do you respond to that?
Well, I don't know if like is the right word, but I really sort of like that particular example. Now, Richard Dawkins did not come up with it. And he's one of the new atheists, and that one was well known by the old atheists for a long, long time. In fact, in my late teens, when I was drawn to 25 years of atheism, that was one of the arguments that had an impact on me. The idea of God is self-contradictory. In fact, when Thomas gives his 5 ways, he starts with another version of those. based on the existence of evil. If God is infinitely good, how can there be evil in the world that they conflict? But that one didn't really have a big impact on me. But the one you cited here from Dawkins is one that made an impact on me. Boy, think about that. Yeah, that's a logical contradiction, isn't it? Well, Thomas doesn't directly address that one in his 5 proofs, but he does address it wonderfully, talking about some of God's attributes. Okay, so to think that being all-knowing and all-powerful are in conflict is, in a sense, thinking of God as a glorified human being rather than God as he must be according to the nature of these proofs. So according to Thomas, part of the nature of God, there's no potential in him. He's purely actualized, complete act. He lacks no perfection. He doesn't change. He's everything that he is all the time. So he is eternal. He doesn't have a past and a present like you and I do. Everything is the eternal now for him. So he doesn't have a yesterday and tomorrow. It's all there present for him. And Thomas gives an example of this. He says that, a person who walks along the road doesn't know everybody who came before him and after him. But a person who is observing from a height high above does see the whole scene. And in that sense, God sees things from the perspective of eternity. So there is no contradiction there. There is no yesterday or tomorrow for him to change his mind. Because again, he doesn't change. He has that eternal knowledge and the eternal power.
So let's move on to argument number 4 that talks about how there's always a potential that needs to be actualized. This is a good segue. So if you're attaining to become a good athlete, for example, you're going to want to train, you're going to want to check your diet, get good sleep, you want to learn the game itself, you want to know everything about how you can be the best player possible at this particular game that you're really working at, right? And so you can actualize yourself to become the best version of that thing that you're trying to be, that player, and hopefully achieve success, right? So here's a good example that I found from the internet that kind of, I don't know, it makes sense, but at the same time it doesn't. What happens when those things are technically negative? So for example, bananas can be both moldy and wet. So the maximum moldiness cannot rest in them, but is in some other source which the bananas should get to know and understand, which is the perfection of moldiness. I thought that was pretty interesting. So when you think about the perfection of a negative aspect of life, I mean, athletes, easy to understand. What does it mean to become a perfect athlete? Well, it means to be physically fit and to win championships and to constantly win. But even then, an athlete still makes mistakes and is still never really quite perfect. When you're talking about the spiritual side of things, that takes on a different aspect, as opposed to when you're looking at the physical side of things, as with the banana and its mold. So how can something become perfectly moldy, I guess is the question we're asking.
Yeah, and it's funny, maybe you're aware that Professor Dawkins, again, has given a similar argument here. His is that then God must represent the maximum ultimate smelliness would be another thing. Moldiness, smelliness, all things. But yeah, these particular trivial attributes are not what Thomas is talking about here. He gives examples in the 4th argument of gradation of being or degrees of perfection. He's giving examples of things like goodness itself, nobility, and truth. One thing to remember about what Thomas says that as far as goodness goes, anything that exists in itself has a degree of goodness by the very fact that it exists. Now privations or evils are actually a lack of a good that something should have. So like moldiness from the perspective of a person eating a banana then would be an evil because it lacks the privation of the healthy, tissue of the banana. So this is not what Thomas is talking about. He's talking about degrees of perfections of these fundamental aspects of being, and also of truth. Now Aristotle said too that the more truth a thing has, the more being a thing has. And I think of it also in terms of truth is this way. As human beings, we try to find out truths, and I also talk about truths with small t's. We look at these little truths, through the senses, through our logical reasoning, and try to get at the real truth of a matter. And for those people these days who still believe there is truth to be had, Thomas would hold to what's called the correspondence theory of truth, where truth is when our idea and an external reality correspond. They match up. There's a direct correspondence between what we think and what really is. But now we know of God, and we get this part from Scripture that where Christ even says He is the truth. So God is truth with a capital T. So for God, it's not just a matter of does what He think corresponds to objective reality? Because objective reality is based entirely upon His thought. So He is the absolute perfection of truth. He is the truth with a capital T. Anytime we grasp a truth, we're participating or grabbing onto a portion of that capital T truth that He represents. And Thomas argues it's the same way with these attributes like goodness or nobility. The fact that we exist, that we're good, is partial and is participated in through the ultimate goodness that is God, who's the source of all goodness.
It's interesting that you mentioned the fact that all things in existence have a certain degree of good in which they are, because otherwise they wouldn't exist. When you think about the devil, for example, who is obviously has the most privations of truth or the most privations of good, it must drive him absolutely bonkers to realize this, the fact that he himself is kept in existence because of some good that he has, albeit tiny, right?
That's right. And you use a key phrase there too, kept in existence. So according to all of Thomas's proofs, again, it's not just God as a creator, only as creator in the past, but God is the sustainer, through Him, through who we live and breathe and are what we are every moment of our lives.
And that brings us to probably the biggest argument. We mentioned it a little bit earlier, but I'd like you to expand on it if you don't mind. Argument 5 talks about how God creates everything in nature because there's a design to everything, and it seems that even when you look at the forest and the trees, there's a specific way that they flourish. There's a specific way that they're planted, all by themselves. They're in rows. They have the branches that flow out. Everything seems to be specifically designed in a particular way. That goes beyond forests. I mean, that goes with communities. That goes with people. There is a predictable way for these things are going to grow and flourish. And so if all things are by design, then why does evil exist in the world?
Well, yeah, and again, Thomas does in that section on the proofs, he gets around after the fifth proof, he replies to the objections. And the first objection to the idea of God was about evil. And Thomas there, he borrows from St. Augustine. He says, God allows evil to exist so that an even greater good can come from it. Like the fact that, He gave us intellects and wills, where we're not just automatons, we're not just subject to instinct like animals or training from outside source. We can actually make choices. God giving us that great power, He also gave us the potential to choose the wrong things, to do evil, to choose lesser goods. So, we suffer the consequences of that to embrace the higher good of being self-directed rational beings, and also then having the potential to enjoy eternity with God if we choose to obey His will.
So I guess this will be our last question. How would you recommend using the 5 proofs of the existence of God as told by Aquinas when it comes to evangelizing the world or evangelizing others in general, especially atheists and non-believers? How would you recommend, inserting this into a conversation with them?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I think, too, I don't think I did too much on the third question, the third argument. I'm going to bring this into it, too. Hopefully we encounter people who are seriously seeking whether God exists. Like, I can call myself an atheist for 25 years. And it was based on these logical arguments. One that when we talked about, the idea that God was somehow self-contradictory. And I'd never heard of Thomas's argument to show, so I could see through that one. But another one that really pulled me away was the argument that you don't need to bring God into explaining. Let's keep things around. Existence exists. Nature is out there. We don't need to say, where did it come from? That's the starting point, right? And actually, before Thomas gives his proofs, he gives that another objection. He says we don't need to make unnecessary complications here. Let's start with the fact of nature. And we know that we think and do things. We can also use human reason as a starting point. And interestingly, an atheistic group inspired by Ayn Rand called the Objectivists. They kind of start with these two premises themselves. They say existence exists. The starting point is there's a world around us, and we also know there's consciousness. There's human will there. But Thomas says too that we need to show though that even those are not truly primaries and fundamentals. So that third proof of his taps into this idea where the idea that anything we see in the universe, nothing gave itself its own existence, I didn't exist even in the womb before the year 1960, My existence came from someone else. I'm sure everyone else's did too. But everything in the universe, nothing gave itself its own existence. Matter can't do that. So there has to be some being that of necessity exists. In other words, its essence is to be, to exist, and to pass that existence on to others. And that is God, is that one necessary being, the true ground of all being, that explains even nature, that explains even the existence of the human will. When I came across these arguments in Thomas, it really had an impact on me in helping me see through those arguments. But here's the thing, too, for evangelization. If you read these arguments like this from Thomas, and again, they're briefly summarized in the Summa, they're great length in other places, but amazingly, in Scripture, they're kind of summarized in about 2 words. If you look at Exodus, the 3rd chapter, and Moses meets God there at the burning bush, and, Moses says, who are you? And God says, or he says, what's your name? He says, I am who am. Okay, I am who am. And he says, tell the people that he who is sent you. So right there, these supposedly primitive people out in the desert are summarizing this idea that we get at the gist of all these proofs that God is the only being whose essence and existence are one. The fact that he exists and what he is are the same thing. It's the being. He's the source and fount of all being. It's kind of at the kernel of all these proofs. He's self-subsistent being, the source of everything else, the one thing that doesn't need a cause. We don't say who made God, because then you're considering him like created things instead of the creator. So in other words, to make a long story short, to reach out to people, I point out that for people who won't buy into the Scriptures, who don't believe in that, if they're willing to reason, point out Thomas's 5 ways, if they care to go through them, are based entirely on reason. For those who are willing to put some credence in the Scripture, you can kind of put the icing on the cake by pointing to them in Exodus 3:15. It's summarized, this profound idea that's behind all of these proofs. Also, Jesus himself says that later. Before Abraham was, I am. So here we have it even in the words of Jesus Christ himself. So it all just fits together so nicely. So if you're out there with people in the world who are not believers but who might be willing to, I would just want everyone to keep in mind this profound philosophy dovetails in what we are taught through revelation in the Scriptures. And because these proofs start with the simple things that we can see before us, if a person wants to read them, maybe read some other commentaries, think about them, it can be a fairly easy way to introduce the topic to other people and get them to maybe have an aha or realize they haven't, now they're seeing something they hadn't thought of before.
It's interesting that I never thought about the whole I am connection with Aquinas' 5 ways. I just finished reading a quote by Archbishop Fulton Sheen, since we've been talking about the devil a lot quite in this interview. The devil obviously tries to convince people that he doesn't exist, being the complete opposite of Jesus in that he is who isn't. And it seems to be a lot more logical to understand the light of the existence of the devil through the great I am, because he who is can only be holy, good, and beauty, whereas he who isn't is the one that many people believe doesn't even exist in the devil, and yet are being, I would say, bamboozled by the fact that he does exist because of his stealthily temptations. And so, yeah, I never thought about that, but definitely a great connection.
Yeah, it sure is. Yeah, I mean, not only would the devil like us to think God doesn't exist, he sure does want us to think that he doesn't exist. Exactly. So he can, operate upon us. And that kind of, in some ways, does sum up what are some of the goals of our secular world. There is no God, there is no devil. It's all up to us. We'll determine what's true, what's right, what's good.